agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I'm joined by the professor of law at Chase Law School, Ken Katkin. Welcome to the show, Ken.
Hey, it's great to be back, Trey.
Well, it's great to have you back. Last week I got to be part of the three-man show with Mike and Jay, which is always a little different. We each have our own take on how we do things, so it's nice. This is more of home base again for me. So you're my home base, Ken. I guess is what I'm saying. This is my love letter to you. Anyway, but in all seriousness, this week what we're going to be doing on the show is we're going to be talking about the Russian conflict, what's been going on there. Obviously, we had a chance to talk preliminarily about that last week, but we'll speak more about that and with Ken this week. We're going to also talk about the developing criminal potential activity being uncovered by the January 6th committee against Trump and Trump associates. And then we're going to move on to talking about Biden's State of the Union address this past week. We're going to talk about the new White House COVID strategy. We're going to talk about the Texas primary. And then we're going to talk about a couple of Supreme Court cases with some reach that came out this past Wednesday. And so that's what we're going to be doing in just a moment. Okay, so Ken, a lot of things are going on this week in Russia. As a matter of fact, if listeners or anything like me, you spend a lot of your time just trying to kind of figure out where are we and what's going on in Russia. So, last week I had a chance for, to kind of offer my uniquely weird perspective with Mike and Jay. Mike and Jay are a little bit more those kind of real politics guys when it comes internationally. So let's get us up to speed as what's happening in Russia as of Friday, March 4th. Friday morning, Russian forces seized the largest nuclear plant in Europe after some massive shelling on it. That's probably one of the biggest stories going on this morning. The massive downside, of course, to massive shelling at a nuclear site is the potentiality that we could have a fire and a nuclear disaster of some sort taking place, which was a lot of what was going on in the headline. The Ukraine has noted that Russia is raising the specter of a nuclear disaster, and probably rightfully so. Russia, on the other hand, is actually saying this is all part of the Ukrainian Nazi plot. Yeah, it sounds like a weird television show, but that was the response. Additionally, after the attack, the mayor of the nearby city was forced to kind of read almost a hostage white paper, claiming a number of knowingly untrue things, that Russians, for example, were only using blanks, which is kind of a bizarre position to be in, although in all honesty, it appears from the video that he's in distress and kind of almost doing that at gunpoint. Meanwhile, Russia and the south of Ukraine have finally claimed their first major city of Kherson. This has been part of the heavily shelled region in the south. The Russian military column that has been headed for the capital the last 48 hours or so continues to remain stalled, to the best of anybody's knowledge, as a result of a lack of fuel, supply lines, and potentially food. The question, of course, on the analyst side has been, well, is this behind schedule? Is Ukraine holding up? Or is there, in fact, what was planned by Russia? And that is, of course, a big point of contention between Russia and the rest of the EU. Military analysts in the United States have been arguing that this clearly is showing a problematic struggle, that they can't get in and control Ukraine as quickly as they thought, and are pointing towards a long, in some cases, decades-long struggle that could be taking place here. Likewise, Vladimir Putin continues to argue that everything is going according to plan. Meanwhile, as a result of the sanctions that we had been talking about last week and additional sanctions placed on Russia this week, the Russian market continues to crash. As a matter of fact, the Russian market has remained historically closed for the longest amount of time ever. As of the moment that I wrote this, the ruble sits at 221 rubles to the dollar as of this moment. But of course, the market not being open means that's actually probably a lot lower than what it's showing on the screen screen when you take a look at that. Putin, as a matter of fact, this in an interesting, and want to talk about this, Ken, move, actually asked for no more sanctions. He argued that there is no ill intent with his, but then meanwhile, in a phone call with French President Macron, he tells us that the worst has yet to come. That's a lot going on, Ken. And so I'm curious about your thoughts overall. We oftentimes do the international thing, but I also thought I want to kind of spin it this way. You know, Mike and Jay, they're pretty united in their policy positions that I noted at the beginning here. They're kind of those real politics guys. They're cold warriors. Do you agree with that kind of take on what's going in here? What international relations lens do you think is the best way to be viewing the crisis in the Ukraine, and how might our response ought to be applied by that? So a chance for you to weigh in on this, Ken.
Yeah, well, first, I have to apologize. You have me at a disadvantage because I didn't hear what Mike and Jay had to say last week. I should have listened to last week's show, but I haven't. So you characterized it as real politic, but would you mind, just for my benefit, like briefly summarizing it so I could respond to it?
So, in short, the idea that the traditional balance of power theorem that we need to show and maintain military strength in the face of enemies so that they won't undertake these kinds of activities, and that the fact that we haven't taken that seriously is the reason why we see these kinds of bullying aggression from Russia. To kind of just quickly sum that up.
Yeah, well, I guess I don't completely share that perspective. I mean, In a certain sense, you know, I would also characterize myself as a Cold Warrior, and I'm a big fan of what the West was able to do in terms of containment during the Cold War. But I would also note the limits of what the U.S. was able to do during the Cold War. You know, so I mean, the U.S. and the West were not able to do a single thing about it when Stalin, you know, marched into Czechoslovakia and put down the Prague Spring, or you know, essentially kept all the territory that he had agreed with Hitler that he would get under the Hitler-Stalin Pact. You know, there was nothing, because the one thread that ran through the whole Cold War was that because both powers were nuclear powers and a nuclear war could mean the end of the world, no American soldier ever fired a single shot at a Russian soldier or vice versa during the entire Cold War. And I think that was necessary in order to literally save the world. So I think, you know, Biden is similarly as constrained as Truman and Kennedy and people that you might look at and say they were stronger Cold Warriors than Biden. But they didn't really do anything more, I think, than what Biden is doing now during the whole Cold War. And it was fought, you know, in terms of a lot of maneuvering and a lot of proxy battles outside the immediate Soviet sphere of influence, and things like that. And so I give Biden a lot of credit for what he's doing. I actually think he's doing everything possible short of having U.S. troops engage with Russian troops, and I don't think it's possible to have U.S. troops engage with Russian troops, and I don't think any U.S. president has ever thought that it was.
Now, to kind of add into that, one of the other things that makes this particular encounter different than the Cold War, and you're right, why you have these proxy fights during the Cold War, you know, we're actually seeing large-scale ground invasions in Europe. Do you think the fact that we have actual traditional fighting taking place in Europe, making this potentially a different kind of situation than it was during the Cold War? Maybe a different sets of tools might need to be used.
No, I don't believe it is different. I believe the Soviets did send actual ground troops into Czechoslovakia, into Hungary, into Poland. And the U.S. and the West just could not respond in kind with ground troops. They sent massive ground troops into East Germany, including even, you know, they did the Berlin blockade, which we responded to not by shooting our way through, but by doing the Berlin airlift to bring supplies in. So I don't think it's different in kind at all. I think the main way that the Soviets maintained a sphere of influence in Eastern and Central Europe during the entire Cold War was by deploying the Red Army there, in the confidence that the Western ground troops would not show up there.
So now another element of this that we didn't have a chance to reflect on last week was, well, for one, Putin had not yet made, and it's difficult to say exactly what it means other than being a threat, but the idea of having nuclear forces on high alert, combined with what we saw this morning, which was pretty much a disregard for worry about nuclear fallout in terms of the traditional shelling of a nuclear site. Do you think that given the conditions of what we're going on, I mean, maybe the closest example of where we have kind of this active nuclear threat might be the Cuban Missile Crisis? In the context of that, what do you think? I mean, you say you support the Biden position, and I can understand that. But does this give you pause or make you wonder about, does this make anything different, again, I guess, from the Cold War era?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that is slightly different. I think if you're going to, so in the Cold War era, I think the areas that were inside the Soviet Union, and Ukraine would have been one of those areas. Mm-hmm. The West didn't really even try in any particular way to try to pick off those regions and pull them towards the West. So more of the maneuvering and wrangling went on in areas further west than that. And I think, the West was actually successful in both Austria and Finland in pulling those two countries out of the Soviet sphere of influence. The West was less successful in all the other countries, in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary, and in Poland, where there were uprisings and people in those countries, did want to get out from under the knuckle of the Soviet Union. And, there was some limited efforts to help them with that, but none really succeeded. In terms of that, I think Ukraine, and you used the Cuban Missile Crisis example, and I think I used that the last time you and I talked about that as well. Ukraine is really, right on the border of Russia. And so that's different than countries like Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Poland, where there's some distance there. And, I think, although I don't believe that the U.S. would have used any kind of alliance with Ukraine to launch any kind of military attack on Russia under any circumstances. I do understand why Putin would be afraid of that in the same kind of way that the U.S. was afraid. It's one thing for Russia to be a nuclear nation. It's another thing for Russia to put those nuclear missiles on Cuba 90 miles away from here. So I can certainly see why what seemed like a drift towards all of the Eastern European countries joining NATO might have struck Putin as a somewhat existential threat. As the NATO umbrella comes closer and closer and closer to the Russian border. So I do understand that. I think that's why, you and I might have talked about these issues a month or two ago. And I think we both predicted that ultimately Putin's sense of this being an existential threat means that it will be very hard for him to back down. And in some sense, it's going to be the U.S. and the West that are going to have to figure out how to work out an accommodation or a compromise that can bring an end to the conflict.
Well, as the team that I think, once upon a time, I've said before, we make the most predictions. If you go back to that show, we almost have the exact day correct for the time. Because remember, we talked about it in terms of the Olympics, and then how much post-Olympics did we think that the conflict was going to occur, and we almost had it down to the day. Again, I always wonder, how much should we toot our own horn? But I think we were right. Because again, I think sometimes it's easy to forget that there are institutional and structural reasons why people behave on average the way that they do. I think a lot of times there's this thought, the behavior is kind of randomly distributed, and it's not. As a social scientist, at least, I don't think it is. I mean, you're a lawyer, but I'm sure you agree. Actually, let me respond to because I do agree. And so the Olympics, apparently I saw some news reporting, and I think you were the one who was more sensitive to the Olympics than me, but I saw some news reporting this week that China, in fact, did ask Putin not to do anything until after the Olympics. So that, your idea that the Olympics were going to be highly relevant, I think has proved out. The other thing, I think, when we think about the kind of threats that Putin perceives, one thing the one way I've been trying to think about this is I think it's in a way very
fanciful. If he's worried that the U.S. Was going to launch a military attack against Russia, I think he's kind of, I mean, he might have a fear of that because of history, but that seems to me to have not been a serious thing. Like, I don't think the U.S. was considering attacking Russia. But on the other hand, I think there is one kind of threat, a different kind of threat that Ukraine does really pose to Russia, and that's sort of the threat by example, right? That the more Eastern Europe, right up to Russia's borders, really looks west and wants to be a Western style democracy and wants to be part of the European Union and wants to be part of NATO, it makes it more and more untenable for Russia to maintain the kind of system that it has, right? Because they become an outlier with a uniquely bad system, and now all of their own citizens and residents can have relatives in places like Ukraine, or do get to travel to places like Ukraine. And the closer the West moves as an example of just a much more desirable system and a much more desirable way of life, I think that's the kind of true existential threat that a country like Ukraine, if it was left on its own and became more successful and more Western, it's a political threat that it poses to the system in Russia.
I think you're absolutely right about that. And I would actually take that further and make a different kind of prediction forward from this now that I've had more time and data to think about it. And that is, as we take a look at what Putin has done, in some ways, he has offered a positive. And I'm careful in what I mean by this here. What I'm saying is that by him flexing in this way for, as you, I think, are rightfully noting, that kind of existential political threat, he has reinvigorated the importance of liberal democracy. And I think that liberal democracy was something in many of the major Western countries we had almost seen as potentially bad, or maybe being questioned in a new way. And I think by having the external threat that he has now posed, he has once again created a space where, it's a reminder of the importance of the rights, liberties, and the systems that comes in a liberal democracy, where the rightful ballot box is what determines things. And you don't have to look any further than some of the consternations that individuals like Tucker Carlson has had to go through to kind of, well, I love Putin, but I can't, I love America. Like, how do I deal with this? And I mean, again, I don't particularly give to anything about Tucker Carlson, but rather that larger question of, I think it becomes more difficult to, in these broad strokes, attack liberal democracy in a way that I think we saw occurring inside of some advanced Western democracies. What do you think about that?
It's complicated. I think there are some countries, I would probably identify Hungary and Turkey, which are very far from being liberal democracies.
Hungary's a great AI.
Yeah, but they want to be in NATO, and they do feel threatened by Russia, right? So I don't know that I would say that the dividing line is necessarily between the liberal democracies and the authoritarian regimes, because there's some authoritarian regimes who are actually also threatened by Russia and also want to be in NATO, and then the Tucker Carlson thing I think is also complicated, because I think Putin's Russia is more or less the ideal state in the mind of someone like a Tucker Carlson, and that's why he's been a fan of Putin, right? It's authoritarian. It's a white country. It's a country where the religious right has a great deal of power over social norms.
Well, there's no gays, as I understand it. There's no gays,
right? Yeah. I mean, I think everything that Tucker Carlson sort of stands for, Putin's Russia sort of stands for, and I think that's why he was the last major pundit, I think, even after the war started, who was still really much propagandizing in favor of Putin. And I think the only reason he backed down is because it wasn't his own viewers weren't buying it, right? That there's an overwhelming sentiment in the United States, even among Fox News viewers, that there's just something very wrong about Putin invading Ukraine. And part of that, I think, is because President Zelensky has just been so heroic and so telegenic that the American public as a whole is really identifying with him. And I think that's the only reason that Tucker Carlson had to back down. I think he couldn't quite bring his audience with him, and so he had to move back towards them.
I agree. And I would say, again, I think that's an example of a solidifying of that liberal democratic principle. But no, I think you're absolutely right to say that it's more complicated than just that singular variable. So one more thing on that macro level before we bring it to the American side of the response to Russia in a bigger way. And that is one of the other things that we talked about on the show last week was the effectiveness of sanctions. Now, in the international politics literature, one of the things that I had pointed out was that sanctions rarely actually bring about the policy change for which one is hoping for. Now, it can have other kinds of effects, but it generally doesn't actually change the behavior. So, for example, you see this happening right now, as we talked about with the ruble sitting at less than pennies on the dollar, not necessarily going to be changing the behavior of Putin. So what do you see as we continue to see these kinds of economic sanctions? I know you kind of briefly said, hey, I think that Biden's pulling all the levers that he can or should. What do you think, in your view, what do you think might be the view of the pulling of those levers before we bring it over here into the United States?
Yeah, well, first, of course, you're right about the limits of sanctions as if that's the only tool in your basket. It's either not going to do the job or it's going to take a long time to do the job. But within that frame, I do think right now the sanctions regime that's actually being imposed on Russia may prove to be the most effective sanctions regime in history. And it still, of course, hasn't caused Putin to stop this invasion yet. And I wouldn't expect it to do that tomorrow or the next day. But I think the invasion at some point, even perhaps after it's completely succeeded and Putin has occupied whatever territory he wants to occupy, he's managed to assassinate Zelensky. It may happen after all that, but at some point, as happened to the Soviets in Afghanistan, the economics of maintaining an occupation in the face of sanctions is going to become untenable. And I think that's going to happen a lot sooner here than it happened in Afghanistan, not only because everything's moving faster, but also because the global economies are far more interconnected now than they were then. And for instance, Putin, he has stockpiled a lot of foreign currency, and I think he thought that, that would be some reserves that would get him through a sanctions regime. But he, in fact, stockpiled a lot of it in Western financial institutions.
Which he can't access.
Yeah, which he can't access, right? So that's kind of a way that, a modern sanctions regime that has the large buy-in from a large number of Western countries in a world where, not only is finance, completely globalized so that it's hard for him to even access his own money if he can't access the global financial system, but also production of various kinds is very globalized so that, most goods that are produced in the world, on an industrial scale, are using, parts that come from different parts of the world and things like that. And so, a sanctions regime that a significant amount of the world is buying into, is going to bring Russia's economy, backwards by decades, really. And I think that politically makes things much more unsustainable for him. So I think it's all going to take a toll. I would not predict that it's going to make it impossible for him to carry out this occupation, but I would predict that it may be a shorter occupation, than we've seen, when these kind of military operations have been launched in the past.
So let me bring the Russian crisis home to Congress, because there are some changes, obviously, on the United States side. We've been hinting at that at a little more. I'm going to make it a little more explicit. One of the other big things to happen this week, Ken, is there's a congressional angle, and we've seen some pretty widespread bipartisan support for Ukraine, which is both unique for the fact that we're seeing bipartisan support, which is something that has not been happening recently for many items, but also for this week specifically, a resolution calling on Russia to withdraw from Ukraine. It was a 426-3 vote. The three holdouts were Paul Gosar from Arizona, Thomas Massie from Kentucky, and Mass Rosendale from Massachusetts. Now, all three of those are Republicans. Now, the 7-page resolution in which they voted against, not a huge document. You can take a look at it yourself if you're a listener. But basically, it demands a ceasefire and a withdrawal of Russian troops. It supports Ukraine's sovereignty and integrity. It backs the ongoing sanctions. It urges partners to deliver defensive aid and also to provide for humanitarian aid, and finally to reaffirm support for Article 5 of NATO, the idea that any country should be able to freely determine whether or not they want to petition for membership. Now, we have this interesting way. So why the three holdouts? I was a little bit curious. I'm always kind of following Massie a little bit. Massie argued that he opposed the resolution because, quote, the resolution contains an open-ended call for additional and immediate defensive security assistance, he said. He went on to, quote, say, this term is so broad that it could include American boots on the ground or, as some of my colleagues have already requested, U.S. enforcement of a no-fly zone, end quote. Elsewhere, he argued in tweets, quote, it expands the geographic scope of the United States' commitment to the conflict in Ukraine by condemning the country of Belarus. We should not be seeking to name new enemies or committing to overturning other governments, end quote. What do you think about the votes and the more specific positions by congresspersons on the Ukraine? And do you think any of this will have any kind of real impact? I mean, obviously, this is vastly bipartisan. I mean, we have three against votes. But do you gather anything from this, Ken?
Well, I'm always interested in Congressman Massie as well. He is the congressman who represents the district that includes my workplace, Northern Kentucky University. He's an extreme iconoclast, and he actually does like to explain why he makes these iconoclastic votes. And you were reading from his tweets there, some of his explanations. He
doesn't have exactly the Trumpian tweets, right? He outlines them. Yeah, I agree with you. I agree. Continue. Sorry.
Outlines them. Yeah, and I appreciate that. In this particular case, I agree with a few of his technical points, but I think they're only technical points. And, ultimately he may be losing the forest for the trees on those. And I don't agree with his larger substantive points. So, I think that the technical points that I do agree with, and I actually wish Congress would have responded to his concerns and changed the wording a little bit, because I think he's right, is that, President Biden is saying that we're not going to have a no-fly zone and we're not going to put American boots on the ground in Ukraine. And I think Massie rightly is saying, well, if that's what he's saying, why don't we have that in the resolution? Why are we having a resolution that authorizes him to do those very things that he says he's not going to do? I think Massie's right about that. I would have actually rather seen a resolution that makes clear the limits on what kind of force is being authorized, as well as authorizing, other kinds of actions. But on the other hand, I think, that wouldn't have caused me to vote against it because I do trust President Biden. I think he has said, very clearly and very repeatedly that he is not going to take this resolution or his own executive powers as authority to put boots on the ground in Ukraine or start a nuclear war. So, I'm not that worried about it. To me, the bigger point here would be to vote in favor of the resolution as a way of showing, solidarity in the United States and in the West in opposition to what Putin is doing, and authorizing the U.S. government to do all the types of actions that it's already been doing, and aligning Congress with the White House there. So I would have voted for it, but I think his point is right that it would have probably been better if it would have clarified that limit. His other point about Belarus, I don't agree with at all. I think it's quite right that we're condemning Belarus. Belarus has joined Russia in these operations and has allowed Russian troops to use Belarus as a launching point for a lot of its military operations here. And it would have been much more difficult for Russia to launch these invasions without the cooperation and participation of Belarus. So I'm not sure why he says we shouldn't be seeking to name new enemies. they're part of the invasion that we're condemning. So why not name them? And I don't think we have committed to overturning any government. So I think he's exaggerating there. This resolution doesn't commit us even to overturning Putin's government. It just commits us to trying to do what we can to support the Ukrainians in repelling the invasion. So I think he went too far in a few of his claims, but I certainly at least respect his idea that I think I've drawn an analogy that when Bush came to the Congress in 2002 and asked for authorization to use force against Saddam Hussein, he said that he only wanted the authorization so that he could threaten Saddam Hussein, and that he wasn't actually going to use force. And then as soon as he got the authorization, he used the force. So I can see why Massey is concerned about wording that's too broad, and it is a concern that I share, but I don't share it enough to that I really
would change that vote.
He did the right thing. Yeah, it would change that vote exactly.
Well, and additionally on the Belarus, for additional context, I mean, at one point they have been discussing whether or not to actually join in a formal way the military invasion, and that could, as I have thought about, also be a sign of the fact that Putin's not sure he can get it done by himself without additional help, given their scale and ability to move through Ukraine has been pretty limited. Had they not been able to invade from the north, you would not see as many besieged cities currently, I do not believe, at least at this point in the campaign. But, well, any final thoughts you'd like to add on Russia before we move forward, Ken?
Yeah, I mean, Putin is about 70 years old, and I do wonder, also if when Gorbachev became the premier of the Soviet Union, that was right after the Brezhnev era and the Khrushchev era, and I think it was surprising to the West how sudden the changes were there, and how Gorbachev was really representing what I think was the majority view within the Soviet Union, that the Soviet people were really sick of the Brezhnev era and the Khrushchev era and the authoritarian Cold War era. And I do think that it's hard for me to imagine that what Putin is doing is what the Russian people want. And I do wonder if whoever succeeds him, will really be the next Gorbachev and really make big changes.
Yeah, that's a harder one to predict, especially when you talk about being 70. But of course, our last two presidents have been a decade older than that. So just for context,
right?
But be that as it may, it's still a worthy point in the long term. Although I'm just anymore, I'm not sure if I'd quite put the age thing there. Well, why don't we?
Yeah, maybe. Well, maybe you're right.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Well, I mean, we're just getting old. I mean, people clearly
people live forever now.
They live forever, and we vote for people, and or we allow even in in authoritarian, non-democratic regimes, we allow individuals who are older to hold longer positions of power. I mean, that seems to be a clear trend.
Yeah, well, I mean, in Putin's case, probably he's going to hold power as long as he wants to. There's really nothing in their system that would push him out of there. But he still, he may not. That may not be infinitely long, but you're right. It could be decades. I was probably being optimistic when I was thinking the fact that he's 70 meant that his days were numbered.
Well, it reminded me a little bit of Thomas Jefferson. Often, I'm blanking on who he was writing about, but basically said that the best thing that good men could do was to pray for, his old age to take him. Right. So I feel a little bit of that in your comment, right? And in his case, he was talking about somebody who was in his 40s. It was, even for his time, was too soon. But that same kind of hopeful, optimistic that nature will run its course.
Yeah.
Well, why don't we move forward to the January 6 maneuvers this week? Okay, so the January 6 Trump activity, Ken. The House January 6th committee, in a court filing this week, said that there is potential evidence in John Eastman emails with Donald Trump and his associates that Donald Trump and his associates committed crimes, specifically in attempting to prevent Congress from certifying the 2020 election results. Following the riot, Eastman, quote, sent an email to Vice President Pence's lawyer stating that the siege is because you and your boss did not do what was necessary to allow this to be aired in a public way so that the American people can see for themselves what happened, end quote, according to the court filing. The court filing goes on to say that later that evening, the plaintiff made a final plea to the vice president, saying, I implore you to consider one more relatively minor violation. Those are his words. I implore you to consider one more relatively minor violation of the Electoral Count Act and adjourn for 10 days to allow the legislatures to finish their investigations, as well as to allow a full forensic audit of the massive amount of illegal activity that has occurred here, end quote, according to the committee's documents. In other words, Eastman knew what he was proposing would violate the law, but he nevertheless wanted to go ahead and urge the vice president to take those illegal actions according to the committee. Now, the House Select Committee, of course, can't investigate crimes, but the Justice Department can. Now, one of the elements of this, I want to follow up with you, Ken, because this is my area where I have some legal understanding, but I'm always curious about your next take. I know that lawyers in general have privileged communication with their clients. We've talked about that before on the show. And that is, for listeners, if this is new to you, if I'm your lawyer and you tell me everything about your case openly, I cannot then be made to testify in court, kind of letting it all out. Now, however, inside of that privileged communication, there is a narrow slice of communication that can be uncovered, and that's called the crime fraud exception. Now, the center idea of the crime fraud exception, as I understand it, Ken, comes from the United States versus Zolan in 1989, which is where the court ruled, look, the quote, the attorney-client privilege is not without its costs, and the element, therefore, is that this covers, quote, prior wrongdoing, end quote. It doesn't cover future wrongdoing. And so what the court says in Zolan effectively is, look, of course you can't be subpoenaed on how you've helped your client for things that have already happened. They're coming to you for that. But there is a moment where you cross over from that. And if you are actively engaging in the crime, in other words, if you are advising in a way to create a future wrongdoing, then you can't shield that communication under attorney-client privilege. And that seems to be a big case of what's going on right here. So do you think that this exception is explicitly applies to Eastman? Eastman's arguing that it does not. Obviously, in this case, the committee and therefore potentially the Justice Department would be saying it does. And so walk us through that a little bit. Have I laid that out properly? And how does that apply here? So.
Yeah, you definitely laid it out properly. The one context I want to put it in before I start responding directly is the crime fraud exception, which has been cited by the House as a reason for piercing attorney-client privilege here. That's actually only the third of three reasons that the House gave why there should be no attorney-client privilege here. And so it's very possible that the court could decide it on one of the first or the second ground and not actually even resolve this particular question. But I think that the simpler ground, which was laid out in the House filing, why there's no attorney-client privilege here, is that there's actually no basis for Eastman to claim that he was Trump's attorney. Right. So he would have, the fact that he is an attorney isn't enough. He would have had to be Trump's attorney. And it does look as though he was just, some guy who, was representing himself and coming forward and pressing these theories upon Trump, and Trump liked the theories. But that whole time, Trump's lawyer was Rudy Giuliani, and Trump's team involved, Lynn Wood and Sidney Powell. That these were Trump's lawyers, that Eastman was never one of Trump's lawyers. And certainly he was never retained by him, paid any money by him. There's no retention.
I don't want to interrupt. I want to ask you a question about that, because I had a question specifically about that one. As I understand it, if you to have the attorney-client privilege, one of the elements that has to be made is that you have in some sense been retained. I didn't realize you could ever claim it without being retained in some way.
Well, you can in one certain circumstance, but I don't think it applies here. So suppose suppose I go to a lawyer and I for the purpose of trying to retain him, and he says, well, okay, tell me about your case. And then and then he says, no, you know what, I'm not going to accept this representation. Information disclosed under those kinds of conditions would also get the attorney-client privilege. So for someone to have attorney-client privilege, they either have to have been the attorney for the client, or they have to at least have learned the information in the context of a conversation where the client was trying to retain them as their attorney and disclose that information. But there's really no significant evidence other than John Eastman's say-so that he was ever Trump's attorney, and Trump has never said so. So I think if Donald Trump doesn't file a sworn affidavit saying that John Eastman was his lawyer in this case, I think the simplest way that a judge could rule against Eastman here would be to say that he finds that Eastman was not Trump's attorney, and so Eastman is not entitled to the attorney-client privilege.
Therefore, not needing the exception.
Therefore, not needing an exception. Yeah, that none of these emails would be privileged. If I would have been sending emails, as a law professor, if I would have been writing to the Biden campaign and saying, look, I'm a law professor, I've studied this stuff, I've got some ideas about how you should respond to these cases that Giuliani is bringing, I could write them an email like that, but that wouldn't make me Biden's lawyer, Yeah. So I think that that's really the context that it's best to look at Eastman in. And in fact, I could say, I don't know if you remember this or not, but Eastman during this period in January of 21, rather than being Trump's attorney, what he actually was my colleague. I don't know if you remember that or not, but he and I were both visiting together.
We talked about that, didn't we?
At the University of Colorado Law School at that time. So yeah, he had a full-time job at the University of Colorado where he was on leave from his home institution of Chapman University, and he was teaching his classes. And it's not. It's not kind of commensurate with having been Trump's attorney at the time.
In other words, your hypothetical about yourself it's not really so much a hypothetical.
Yeah, it's who he was. Yeah, he was. He was spending a lot of time in Washington, admittedly, but he was getting back to Boulder, to show up for his classes and meet his obligations. And that's where he was employed. He was at the Benson Center for the Study of Western Civilization at the University of Colorado, where he was the visiting scholar for that term. And it was the same term I was out there. So he was actually my colleague. And I feel confident that people at the University of Colorado feel like I was a better colleague than he was that semester. So I think they're more glad they had me out there than they had him out there. And
maybe this could be your pitch to come back. Listen, I'm not Eastman, right? I have not brought shame.
Right, exactly. And he was ultimately not allowed to keep teaching undergraduates after his role on January 20th or January 6th came out.
So he was teaching undergraduates as well.
He was teaching. Yeah, he was actually only teaching undergraduates because the Benson Center is a center at the university, and typically, once they decide who to make their visiting scholar, that person gets a courtesy appointment in the relevant college or department. But the law school actually had refused to give him the courtesy appointment, so he was only teaching the undergraduates. Because
I'd like to throw myself out there. We can be colleagues at some point. I am vastly better at Eastman, and I know more constitutional law than he does too. I just would like to point that out.
Right. So you should apply the Benson Center. They generally get very good fellows. And in fact, the previous time I'd been visiting at the University of Colorado, there in the fall of 18, the Benson Center's fellow was Stephen Presser, who's a conservative law professor at Northwestern University Law School, where I went to school. So he had been one of my professors, and I was very delighted that he was out there that semester. And he was one of the professors he's a legal historian who testified when Bill Clinton was impeached at the impeachment trial in favor of the impeachment. It's a good center, but they made a big blunder when they took Eastman. But all of that is to say, I think he's going to have problems even establishing that he was Trump's attorney. And there's no attorney-client privilege if he's not Trump's attorney, and unless except in that slight exception I talked about, where maybe if they had a conversation about whether he could be retained as Trump's attorney, things he learned during that conversation might be privileged. But this wasn't that. Now, getting back to the crime fraud exception, the idea is that if I go to an attorney and I say, look, I'm trying to commit a crime and get away with it. So can you advise me on how best to get away with this crime so that when I commit the crime, I won't get caught? Or if I get caught, I'll get off. Those kinds of conversations between attorney and client are not privileged. So in this particular case, you pretty much summarized it. But the one point I'd want to drill down on more is a lot of the question here about whether this was a crime fraud is ultimately going to have to turn on Trump's mental state, really, because if Trump had a good faith belief that he did in fact win the election, that there was electoral fraud that cost him the election, and that he was trying to come up with a legal strategy to vindicate his legitimate rights, then nothing they talked about would fall within the crime fraud exception. But I think the main evidence in the House filing that isn't the case is just the enormous number of high-ranking members of Trump's own administration who told him that the election was legitimate, right? So, his head of cyber,
including the Justice Department,
including Attorney General William Barr, including Vice President Mike Pence, including the head of cybersecurity in the Department of Homeland Security and the Secretary of Homeland Security, including the acting Secretary of Defense, right? All of these people, when he tried to involve them in his schemes, told him, the election was legitimate and we're not going to get involved in this. And also, he had Giuliani out there litigating these cases. They filed 62 cases. They lost 61 of them. And the only one that they won, it really had to do only with whether observers should be allowed in during the recounts. It really had nothing to do with the underlying substantive fraud in the election. And so, 62 primarily state and local judges, told him that there was no fraud, and he really had no evidence that there was. So I think, even though he would probably swear under oath, that there was fraud and that he still believes that to this day, it is within the range of what the judge could find in litigating this attorney-client privilege question, that Trump's statements to that effect are so implausible that they have to be discredited. That so many people told him there was no fraud, and nobody told him any basis for thinking that there was fraud. That he's not allowed to just say, well, I can't hear any of that, and so I'm just gonna keep carrying out my course of conduct. That at a certain point, that doesn't become credible anymore.
In a similar way, so in other words, you can't have. There's a level where an irrational belief can no longer be a defense for pursuing a particular set of outcomes.
Right, because it would have to be good faith, right? You have to believe in good faith that you're doing things that are legally justified, right? And it just can't be good faith if everybody in his own administration, in the courts, everybody has informed him that he's wrong. Right, that there's just no way that he could be maintaining good faith in carrying out this scheme with Eastman.
Well, let's kind of expand this, because in addition to what was happening there, we obviously had, there appears to be video evidence as a result of a documentary against Roger Stone that's coming to light. They've been doing this for 2 years. And weirdly, it includes answers to many of the questions that Roger Stone had pled the fifth to during his 90 minutes before the committee, where all he did was to plead the fifth, right, in response to every question. In a couple of particularly disturbing videos, he is using Oath Keepers as member of his own personal security guard and explicitly advising Trump to use his powers to prevent the Electoral College members from coming together to vote and to quote, throw them out. Now, I would like to point out, listeners, by the way, Electoral College members don't actually all fly to Washington, D.C., and therefore you couldn't stop them and throw them out. I guess maybe you're trying to do it at each individual state, I suppose. I mean, that's a little, his knowledge of that, who knows? I'm not sure. But nevertheless, the idea that they should, physically and violently keep electoral college members in some capacity from voting.
That can only be criminal. That's not the same as filing a lot of cases in court or trying to convince the members of Congress to try to reject the electoral count or things like that. Yeah, coordinating to launch a violent attack during the count and to keep the National Guard away can only be criminal. Actually, and what we just said about Roger Stone also reminded me of something I forgot to mention a minute ago, which is I mentioned there were 3 grounds for rejecting the attorney-client privilege claim, but I only talked about 2. But the third one, which is implicated by the Roger Stone video that you talked about, is if any information that the attorney or the client has already publicly disclosed, that pierces the privilege, right? So and so to the extent that Trump or Eastman themselves have already talked about the contents of these same emails that he's trying to keep shielded now, the privilege would be forfeited by the attorney or the client's own public disclosure of the same information. So when you talked about how Stone, talked about stuff to a documentarian that he wouldn't talk about to Congress, well, he's not an attorney, of course, but if he had been, that kind of thing would pierce attorney-client privilege.
Now, correct me, can you continue to plead the Fifth once you've publicly talked about the thing over which you wish to plead the Fifth?
Yeah, well, the attorney-client privilege is a little different than the Fifth. The Fifth, someone can plead as much as they want, as long as they're saying it would incriminate them to answer a question. Okay, now, if they've already answered the same question elsewhere, then the fact that they've already answered that question elsewhere and the answers they gave can be used against them in a court of law. But they still, if they don't want to respond to it then, and they want to just say, well, I'm not going to respond to that, I'm pleading the Fifth, they can keep doing that.
Okay, that's what I thought. Well, we'll need in the ad-supported preview on is this. I was blown away by Stone's response for probably what the problem with the video is. I don't know if you saw his response. Did you happen to see that?
No, I didn't see it.
His answer is, look, for all I know, this is probably just a bunch of deep fakes about me. Not great. So good luck with that defense, Roger. But for listeners, I just want you to know this is going to end our ad-supported free portion of the politics, guys. We got more stories coming up in just a moment, including the Biden State Union address, the new White House COVID strategy, Texas primary, and cases and more. We'd love for you to be around for that. If you are a Patreon supporter, you'll be getting that automatically. For those of you who are not, this might be a chance. Maybe you'd like to have more. You want to become a supporter. You can head to patreon.com/politicsguys and or support us by going to PayPal at politicsguys.com/support or through Venmo where we're at politicsguys. So again, if you'd like to have the full version of the show, we'd love for you to become a supporter and become part of that process. There's other things you get as well. You can find out more about that at patreon.com/politicsguys or by going to politicsguys.com/support or on Venmo where we're at politicsguys. If you are not in a financial position to support the podcast right now, but you'd like to be able to have access to that full, you can actually reach out to Mike Baranowski. And if you just email him at mike@politicsguys.com, he would be happy to set you up with full access to the full episode each week. Thank you so much for joining us for the ad-supported preview.